Okay, hi everyone. It's Saturday, October 1st, a mere 2 or 3 days before my birthday. And
Wow.
we're coming live
Okay.
from my mom's house. And this week we are moving into Module 7 for English 510, which is a module on dialogue. So we're going to talk just a little bit about dialogue as we move into this morning. And then I have these two cool prompts that I like. The first one does not engage dialogue, but the second one will. So hopefully, if you don't follow them, that's fine. Writing is all that matters from these weekend get-togethers. So dialogue, you know, the announcement that I've offered you guys that'll go up, at midnight tonight, Pacific time, has a great conversation where I describe some experts who are talking about the way that dialogue for writing really does not perfectly imitate dialogue that happens in real life. So if you were to transcribe the way some people spoke, that wouldn't do the same work that it needs to do when you use dialogue in your own writing. So pay attention to what we read in Dunkelberg and take a look at my announcement. Mostly that announcement's talking about things like we tend to have an agenda when we speak to each other. And so that's something you can pick up when you do witness people speaking to each other. What is their speech work trying to do? And then when you do it in your own writing, you have to pay attention to little things like people will not have long stretches of perfect dialogue in real life. So in writing, if you write a long stretch, say, even more than 2 lines in our essay form of writing, if you write even more than 2 lines of dialogue, already you as a writer should be sitting up and paying attention. Have I gone too long without something like an action beat? And an action beat is when you have a character just, noting something or moving. You might have your character be arguing, listen, Monique, I want you to understand what's the most important thing. Sally then fiddled with her phone for a second and looked up. We have to be sure that we show up in the right place, period. And so that fiddling with the phone part in the middle of that horrible off the cuff example is an action beat. They might fiddle with their phone, they might take note of their surroundings. Anytime that you put one of these action beats in your writing, even if it isn't in the middle of dialogue, what you're doing is regrounding your reader in your scene and reminding them that they are in the created world that you made. And in dialogue, that's a great way to avoid using elaborate, what's the word? It's tags, but there's a word before the word tag. Is it dialogue tag?
Dialogue.
Yeah. So with your dialogue tags, you really want to be using like he said, she said, or avoiding tags because it's obvious who spoke, or using action beats to take the place of she yelled or he pondered or we all have this and I have it probably worse than all of you. I want to have my dialogue tag tell people what kind of dialogue is happening, and we have to back up and trust that our words that we're using will do it, or allow action beats to, express agitation or thoughtfulness or something like that. So, and those aren't your only two options. There's more in the reading and there's more in the announcement. But that's like the big overview I want to do, is to make sure that you don't have your characters speaking too long without a break for your reader, and then to be careful what kind of dialogue tags you use. And dialogue tags is one of the most important things. If you get anything else out of this creative writing program, simplifying your dialogue tags is the most important thing. I worked with David Gates, and Sarah's heard me tell this story before, but I worked with David Gates at the Bennington Writing Seminars, and he was a finalist for the Pulitzer in 1994, I think, like a really qualified novelist. And he even says you shouldn't have she asked. At the end of a question, he still wanted me to use she said. And I'm not perfectly comfortable with that, but he's that strict about how dialogue tags need to be simple and no more than he said, she said. So keep that in mind as you're moving forward with dialogue. Do you guys have any questions about dialogue or anything else?
I wonder why. Why? What's wrong with she asked?
I wonder why with asked, except for that it's obvious she asked with the question mark, right? But I do think it has something to do with interrupting the flow of the reader. But I got distracted by having a she said when she asked something. So as a reader, I've been paying close attention to the way the authors that I'm reading are using dialogue tags because that has been difficult for me. Yeah. So I recommend paying attention to the way that your readers do it. And in 510, we do that fun thing that has a classic text and a contemporary text. And dialogue tags are a really wonderful thing to study the difference of, especially if you have a pretty far back classic text. So for example, if you look at the way that Willa Cather is using dialogue tags in, 1913 versus the way that, Kate Atkinson is using dialogue tags in, 20, was it 17, 18 that she wrote Life After Life, 20, whatever. They'll be different. And we probably should be pushing towards trying to use the contemporary style dialogue tags if we want to be successful in contemporary publishing. Fair enough? Can you guys hear that little bad person barking outside? Are you good?
I thought it was a bird.
I have a bird that's making noise.
Oh.
We have a
bark. All our animals.
Bark. Bark. My husband is pulling into the back of my mom's house, I think. I assume that's why she's barking, but anyway, I hope it doesn't bother you. Okay, yay, dialogue test. So for our exercises today, I have this fun stuff that I've worked up before. And I love this one that you're gonna take your character or yourself, depending on if you're doing nonfiction or fiction. I know Joan's working on nonfiction, but you can do whatever you want. This is just practice writing right now. And the first one doesn't have to have dialogue in it. I'm going to copy and paste it and put it in the chat so you can read it along with me. I'm thinking about going out there and tying duct tape around her little. We're in a town now, and her behavior is not good. I would never do that. Just not funny. Okay, so I'm going to close participants. Read this. Okay, so in the chat, the character is facing a doorway, metaphorical, literal, entering a building for a job interview, setting up on a backpacking trip, something that's going to like be a crisis moment, something that changes their life, or maybe not even a crisis, but they don't know their life is about to change. Leaning in for a last first kiss, some sort of doorway. That'll go for your romance story, right, Sarah, that they made you write? Genre writing in the MFA program. Okay, so think about the short story or the fiction. Short stories in here because I last gave this prompt to 529 and it's all fiction in 529. Take your character through that door. Who do they connect with on the other side? You have to have another person. And walk us through the physical actions that happen. Describe the sensory details of the location. No talking this time. What does your character do? See, taste, smell, touch, hear. I want you to get all 5 senses going. I want you to get us in the scene. And think about what your character wants to say to that other person, but don't let them say it because our next prompt is going to be full of dialogue. Yeah, so this is going to set you up for a dialogue scene. Okay, so do you guys have an idea in mind what you're going to write about? I figure I'll give you a couple seconds to work that out before I get the clock going, right? And in this 6 minutes, I'm literally going to disappear to go get that dog and make her stop barking. So on your marks, get set, right. You have about a minute left. Okay, time's up. Do your best to wrap things up and come back here. Hey. Sorry. Clearly the bad little people are in here with me now because that hey wasn't for you. It was for the one that was being crazy. So how'd it go? How'd this prompt, was it a little frustrating, I hope, in good ways, because you couldn't let them talk?
I didn't think it was frustrating. I just think in my mind, I know the next prompt is their dialogue. So I'm like, okay.
I shouldn't have told you that.
Cheating a little bit by thinking about that.
One question, is not talking internal, like if somebody's speaking to themselves, is that talking?
You know, it's a kind of talking. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that the reason that every class at SNHU with creative writing will have you dealing in dialogue is that you can't leave your character alone too long. Any character that's by themselves too long becomes sort of uninteresting. And so talking to themselves is not considered dialogue, but you also wouldn't have your character doing too much mental monologue is what that is, because there's nobody else in the die with them. Because you need to get your character juxtaposed with people to keep that person being interested. In nonfiction, it's a little weird because your narration, your exposition in nonfiction tends to be kind of what you were thinking and stuff. So that's different because you don't have a character going, I thought this in the same way. Because in fiction, you would take that internal monologue and italicize it to show the thought is happening. And in nonfiction, that would actually just be kind of the prose that you're writing. So we'll see what you got, right? Great. Okay, so does anybody want to read what you got? I don't have anywhere to take notes, so I'm going completely off my head. Wish me luck.
I'll go.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
Cassie sat rigidly in the green two-seater plastic couch at the end of the hallway. When she moved her legs, they stuck to the smooth, warmed leg impressions. A tall, lanky man started walking towards her, his cowboy boots clipped heavily on the cold hospital tiles. She popped another hot tamale in her mouth and bit into it slowly. The sweet burning sensation kept her in the moment, focused. When the tall, lanky man got close enough, she could smell what reminded her of an old barn. What an odd smell, she thought, knowing she should be smelling the surrounded old sterile way that all hospitals permeate. When he looked at her, his eyes were ice blue and crystal clear. They pierced through the fogginess left after the burning of the candy subsided through the mud that filled her mind in her state of depression.
Oh,
I'm
cool.
sorry.
The Indian, that's really neat because we think the mud is associated with the guy and that what I would assume is sort of agricultural smells coming off of a guy. Once you say he's got cowboy boots but he smells, you're like, oh, he's a legitimate cowboy boot wearer, right? And then the mud is with Cassie, and that's unexpected because we expect the mud to be with a boot wearer, in my mind. What do you all think? You're muted, Kate.
All I can think about is the hot tamales.
Yeah, right. What a great detail. What'd you like about them, Kay?
I think that sensory element right away, it draws me in. It just draws me in when you talk about something like that, because we're all familiar with that. You know, this taste and the smell of that. So
What about the technique? And what I mean by that is this character uses that burning sensation from a hot tamale to keep her in the moment. And what are ways that we've seen characters use that type of technique that are more cruel than a hot tamale?
Like self-harm?
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. You know, I mean, from just digging a thumbnail in to create some pain to some really awful things like, you know, cutting and things that make people feel alive and in a moment. And how lovely that you took what I'm positive is a teenage character, because Cassie's always been a teenager when you've been writing about her that I know of. And hopefully you didn't hear much of that. You're taking her and using sort of what the tools she has at her disposal without it going all the way back. I like that because you could use that in the young adult book and people wouldn't be thinking, oh, don't read that because there's, you know, real life things happening in it. Instead, it gives us the real life experience of getting in a moment with a sort of pain without taking it in a place that's too dark. Kind of neat. Joan, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I was thinking about the cowboy boots and the smell, and I say that because I came from a small town and actually worked for a number of years with racehorses as a vet assistant, so it made it very real for me. I remember one time I was with one of my friends and she started laughing at me because she's like, "You smell like horses."
No better smell in the world.
Yeah.
Right.
In my world.
Right.
Yeah. So huge sensory detail. What else did I want to know? Was it cold like most hospitals are? Was it hot because maybe it was, you know, a southern state? The plastic was really nice, and the detail about there being molds already where all the other legs had been gives us a great clue to what kind of healthcare place this is, you know, whether it's very wealthy or right, because a wealthy one wouldn't have grooved, which is why so many of them have hard plastic, which is what I would have expected. So all of it was nice details that help take my assumptions about what a hospital scene will look like and then shape them into what. Great start, definitely.
I'm getting the impression that she's in the hospital maybe for mental health issues because she was depressed.
Yeah, I have that feeling too, because medical hospitals, hard chairs, you know, grooves where other people were sitting. Yeah, I like that idea, Joan. Yeah, and you touched on all the senses, and that was part of the exercise, but also really put us into the scene, which is nice. More color might have been good just to know, you know, were they trying to cheer people up or did they paint it all the colors that make you more depressed, right? Who knows? So great start. Does anybody want to go next?
I'll go.
Okay.
She waited patiently while the realtor punched the buttons on the lockbox and retrieved the key. Finally, the door opened and they walked inside. Blinking as the sun reflected through high windows, her eyes adjusted and she scanned the large room. Breathing in, she caught the fragrance of fresh painted walls. The owner approached her with a slight smile and held out his hand. She shook it. She shook it and nodded graciously, smiling. Can't read my writing. Oh wait, there's one other line. She shook his hand and nodded, hearing the birds right outside the windows, making their presence known. Sorry, my mess. I write, scribble. I can't read it.
And then I started talking and I was on mute. Okay, so thoughts from people. Where do we think this character is?
Maybe at a staged house or something.
Oh, what kind of house? Sorry.
An open house. The
Oh,
stage.
yeah, staged house. Yeah.
I didn't get the impression it was a stage house because didn't she mention something about a lockbox?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily staged, but it was a house for sale. Yeah.
Right, because typically you would use a lockbox if to access the property if it wasn't just open. So I don't think it was an open house. I think it was just somebody showing a house.
Yeah. It doesn't really make sense because why would the door be locked if the owner's inside? So I didn't think that one through, but
No,
Yeah.
but an important clue. You wanted us to know that there was a real estate something happening.
right.
Yeah. So everybody picked up on that, which was really good.
Yeah.
And so do we know what role the character is? Is she character? Is she the realtor? Is she the
No, because I said that she waited while the realtor punched the button. So it's
Yeah.
somebody wanting to purchase.
right? So
It's a
she's somebody
potential-
coming to see the house.
Potential buyer.
Yeah. And the owner's in there. That makes no sense. Like,
I know it didn't make any sense.
no, they're supposed to leave, but owners stay all the time. I
It
mean,
could go creepy.
Yeah, there you go.
yeah, that's kind
I
of
was just trying to figure out what she could touch.
Well,
And, shaking the hand, that was it.
I just wanted to say that it's possible that the owner could have been in the house because sometimes people will either rent the house or so there could be a tenant in the house or they could still be living in the house if it's for sale and they have no other place to go. But if that's the case, you would normally knock on the door.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And
Well, so what
that
are
would've
some
worked better.
options that Kay's character could have to give us that sensory detail that goes along with physical sensation without shaking somebody's hand? What else could that character do?
Was the hand that she shook clammy, calloused, cold?
warm.
Could she like be rubbing her own fingers together and have her own sweaty palms because she's nervous about looking at the house? Like if you didn't want to touch the hand, what else would be a
Right.
physical detail without her touching something?
Possibly the smell of the house.
Oh, sure. Or the area that she's at. Wasn't there a smell of
There was the smell of the freshly painted walls.
freshly painted walls? Yeah.
I couldn't hear that. I knew there was something in there,
Right.
but I couldn't hear it.
Yeah, it's strange, Kay, when you started reading, your voice, which had been a good volume, kind of came in and out a little bit. And I don't know why. I mean, I think that you turned your head, which got your voice going away from wherever. I think your microphone's probably on your right-hand side. So
Okay.
I don't know. But here's some other thoughts. Was it a hot day and could she have a trickle of sweat going down her back? Was it a cold day and the tip of her
Mm.
nose feels numb, or
Mm.
when she walks in the house, is there a temperature change? So you have these opportunities to describe physical sensations that are happening. Does her stomach flip over when she realizes it's, painted in the color that she hates the most? Or,
Mhm, mhm,
or does she feel that lightening of her heart because she's walked into the space that she hopes she will own? Or, there's other ways to create physical sensation without having to literally touch something. And I'm sure we touched on that as writers to remind us that helping readers have the experience of the person's physical experiences, the ones we all know, right? The
I
ones
heard
where,
the birds outside, so was the window open? Was there a draft? Did a smell come in the window?
sure,
Stuff
for
like
sure,
that.
all of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually first had the walls being a squeamish shade of yellow.
See,
So I did have that in there, but then I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't work. So
it does, especially if you
Yellow
were to
wall.
say
it would have worked. But
yeah,
I need her to like like the house, so that no, I change that.
yeah.
But those are great. Those are
Yeah. And
really
all of your decision patterns that you were using were fantastic. Like, how do I get that touch sensation? I do want to deal with the color, but now that's not working for me. And you went on because you had 6 minutes, right? But in your
yeah,
editing
yeah.
and in your writing, these are all the right instincts. So good.
right. Great. Thank you.
Yeah. Joan, do you want to read what you got?
Sure. I have
Okay.
Joel saw a door that approached him from out of nowhere. He was wondering where he was. The last that he knew, he was in the hospital surrounded by his family and friends. He was wondering, had he crossed over or was he about to cross over to the other side of life as he knew it? There was only one way to find out, and that was to go to the other side of the threshold of the door. He took a deep breath and proceeded across the door sill to find people that he knew. Except this time, instead of the loved ones that he had left behind, there stood loved ones that had already passed, some of which he had never met but intuitively knew who they were.
That's a great start. Especially because I'm thinking to myself, I'm running really quick because I wondered, I can't remember in your memoir what your father's name is, but could this be a family member? And could you, for your memoir, be imagining the experience of them crossing over? Because that kind of imaginative act is perfectly fine in memoir. You would just kind of change it out a little to say, like, I imagined that Joe experienced this, and I wonder if he saw this and whatever, but then you can use it if you want. Anyway,
Mhm.
so I was going all memoir on you, so let's have everybody else respond in the normal way.
I liked he took a deep breath and then crossed over the threshold. And I like using that word threshold.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very poignant word. And just, you kind of feel that step.
A very before and after word. Yes.
Like,
And I know that it was like his thoughts, but it didn't feel like you were concerned that that might have been outside of what we were doing, but it didn't really feel pushed or something. It felt okay to me.
Yeah, those kinds of thoughts definitely were not dialogue or monologue. You were simply narrating his experience. So it worked out really well. Definitely.
Oh, thank you.
So one thing came to mind for all three of you that I want to mention, then we can go back specifically to Joan. So I want to say this while I think of it. So Joan had this one proceeded to in there, and there's proceeded to and a matching one that I'll think of in a moment, that anytime you have that, they can just do the thing that's happening. And we all, very guilty here, have a habit of putting that extender in front of it because you're basically saying he's moving on to the next moment. But you don't have to say that. You can just say he crossed the threshold. And if you want to slow him down, do it with some sort of action beat that describes his physicality instead of using the slowing down words of proceeded to, which reminded me, strangely enough, that both Sarah and Kay had adverbs immediately in what they wrote. Like third word in, I think, for both of them. Yeah.
mine was she waited patiently.
Yeah. And what was yours, Sarah?
Cassie sat rigidly.
Yeah. So all,
Uh-oh.
all
I
to
like
say,
adverbs. Dang
don't we
it.
all? Because that makes it so much easier than going through all the trouble of having to find a really powerful verb that says the same thing, you know. Or you could have an amazing metaphor. So, uh, did you have a character named Kay, or is it just a she?
No, I don't have a character name.
She was Job in a dress, right? You know,
She was
whatever.
what?
Job in a dress. Like
Okay.
that's a metaphor, right? You know, you could use a different way to describe what patience is that makes us sit up, because it also, and I'm just saying that in that case, if I use that example of patience, then your character would be somebody who identifies or knows Christian stories, right? Because if she was Job in a dress, and that's the way she sort of, it's almost a self-identifying, no, it's almost a self-identifying thing. I'm sorry. Um, when if the author chooses to do that, you're making a big signal to say, watch for these kinds of things. I'm going to enter the context of something like, say, Christian subculture, right? If you did that. And for Sarah, you could say, you know, some kind of metaphor that ties into depression, something to do with she was obsidian, rigid in her waiting or whatever, but basically like a black stone, she was that rigid, right? Something, and mine again, I promise you, like every time I talk to you, when I give feedback, which I haven't done for 510 yet, I'm not great on my feet, but the concept is find a metaphor or find a strong verb that will mean rigid, that will mean patient. And what the adverb for me now does, it gives me a place in my writing to identify, to go, oh, I can get figurative here, because my instinct was to describe how they were doing something, and now I can do it with figurative language. And it always makes it better to take that adverb out and do a metaphor, a better verb, rearrange the sentence, whatever it takes. But it's a great way. Like, I teach myself to look for physical markers in my writing that now are just like signposts. Oh, I used an adverb. And sometimes, on rare occasion, that adverb is the right thing to be in there, but it definitely has to be a decision. And in both your cases, it was too early in an opening of a writing to hand me an adverb and let me go, no, I believe that you can write in a more interesting way. That's right. Okay, so back to Joan. I'm sorry. So what I loved about what Kay pointed out was, you said he took a breath, and if he's crossing over to the other side of life and death, that's particularly nice, because none of us think about, you know, it makes us pause and go, are we some form of physicality? I mean, you clearly have him cross to a different life. I mean, a different version of, and not the life we know, but the other one, right?
Right.
Is he still breathing? I mean, what a neat detail to make people pause and think about, because do we breathe on the other side? Is it a part of who we are? So that kind of physicality is great. I automatically put a brightness in there that I don't even know if you wrote into the writing, but I took, so one of the things we can't anticipate, and I'm pretty sure I've talked about this already, is the contingent reality that your readers will bring to anything you write. And contingent reality is sort of all of our life experiences that we bring to any given moment. And so when we all talk about a doorway to what I would describe for Joan's writing as the afterlife, immediately all of us bring whatever our sort of understood picture of the afterlife is, and we start imposing that on there. And you don't have a choice about that, sorry. But you can anticipate it as a writer. You can be thinking about the things that readers commonly will bring to something like moving to the afterlife. So I pictured that doorway opening and just light pouring through.
That was nice effect. When you moved back, you had light
Yeah.
on you.
But
Yeah.
if in my
was weird.
contention, the other issues of the taking a breath is taking a step, you know, like if you're dead, you know,
Yeah, all the physicality that
and
goes
it's sort
along
of the
with
same thing of, so it didn't bother me, because I'm like, okay, you know, in my mind, it's like, okay, when you walk through that door, you're still sort of a person, you still have a body, you still breathe. So, but that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that, about the
I
continuality.
hadn't thought about it either until I just started writing.
Yeah.
And then another word that, in this case, it was an adverb, and I think the adverb could be there, though it could be said in another way too, was her use of intuitively. And in that,
Mhm.
we love, I love. I do reading for like the rumpus and stuff, and so we speak in the royal we all the time as we readers. We readers would probably love this idea that, of course, he knows all this ancestry that's standing there before him, because of course he does, right? So intuitively seemed like a well chosen word in that moment, simply because you used one word really to explain how he knew all the people who are standing in front of him, which was kind of neat. Yeah. Now, let me emphasize, it's super unfair of me to get to come to you on a 6-minute writing thing and say, don't have adverbs. This
Yeah.
is just my opportunity to talk about editing, so this speed writing does these great things about getting stuff on the page, but always the stuff that shows up on the page needs editing. And so what I'm doing is like, okay, now we go back to look at our writing and where do we catch some things that we don't want to have. If you turned on that editor that told you not to put an adverb there, it'd slow you down too much. So instead, when you put yourself in pressured writing like this, write whatever comes. Don't, when the editor shows up and goes, you're about to use an adverb, you're like, heck yeah, I am, keep going. And then just teach yourself how to go back and take that adverb as a moment to say, how can I improve my writing right here? Or in Joan's case, maybe it is the right word, right? Okay, I hope this is helpful. But please don't turn on those editors in these 6 minutes. It'll ruin everything. Okay, so we're moving on to the next piece of this, and this is when we're going to get to dialogue. And I'm going to put it in. Ooh, I'm apparently formatting when I'm cutting and pasting. Okay, we're going to put it in the chat so you can read it along with me. And I'm having like 10 thoughts, and I do not multitask well. So one of the things I wanted to emphasize, and you'll see it, I don't know, about a year ago, I wrote the dialogue that's going to be here, and I don't even remember what's in it. So forgive me for that. But I want to emphasize, when you're using dialogue, every time a new speaker speaks, you start a new paragraph. And if you have one character speaking too long, even with your action beats, but they go to a new topic, you can start a new paragraph, but then go into all of our resources and study how to use your quotation marks to still indicate the same person speaking. I read, oh gosh, maybe a year ago, I read a book by Leanne Moriarty. You guys heard of her?
Yeah.
She wrote Apples Never Fall, but she wrote something that's famous. It was like a 6-part TV series. They're on a beach, somebody dies. Anyway, she uses, her characters will speak again. And I really got hung up when I was reading the novel. Dialogue is a really easy place to get confused with. So be sure that you're very careful with your quotation marks. If you have to use dialogue tags, use them, and make sure when you have a new speaker, it's a new line every time, new paragraph, right? Okay, so you'll see me doing that in the chat, or this really bad dialogue I wrote. So this time you're going to revisit the doorway scene, and your character connects with the person or people, in your case, Joan, and they must to them. And the rule is, instead of using dialogue tags, you're only going to use sensory actions, sensory details, or no dialogue tags. If your inner editor is having a hard time, do use he said, she said. I'd rather you get the dialogue out than, trip yourself up. But if you can, have them do some kind of action instead,
So
Cassie looked up. Joe, noticed he was cold, whatever. Some kind of action if they can, or a sensey detail. do your best to keep the conversation moving that way. You know, okay, in your place, in case if there were squeamish yellow walls, she, you know, averted her eyes from the yellow walls, whatever it took. Like she could already picture the color she was going to put over them, right? Those kinds of things. They can have a thought, they can do an action, they can have a sensory detail. I'm trying to help you find ways in this writing prompt to keep dialogue moving without having to use our traditional paths. So in my example, which I wrote in 3 seconds a year ago, hey, did you bring a map? Ruby was tugging at a zipper, her fingers numb with cold. I have 2. Peggy's gear splayed over the tailgate. Berry crumble for dessert, and just like that, Ruby could almost smell the future campfire heating the pouch of berries. She couldn't wait to feel her muscles stiffening after a hard uphill day. I brought lava cake. Oh my gosh, 2 desserts? First, I've got to get to all of this. Peggy made a sweeping gesture back in my backpack. Oh, I have to get all of this back in my backpack. So we have Ruby, and she's tugging at it as if her fingers are cold. We have Peggy, and we know it's Peggy because we're talking about her gear. And then Ruby saying berry crumble for dessert, and she could almost smell the future campfire, and she's anticipating the hike they're going on, the backpack hike. And then Peggy, I brought lava cake, and then Ruby, I've got 2 desserts. First, I've got to get all this, and Peggy is pointing to her gear and get it in the back. You see where none of that had a he said or a she said? There's a ton, and I did write it in a, you know, I put myself in a prompt, a speed prompt, so that I knew this could be done. But if you're having trouble doing that much, just write and have dialogue. Joan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question. So even if it's one line that person's speaking, that's that one person. So then you would break down to the next paragraph, basically.
Yep.
Okay.
So I brought lava cake, next paragraph. Oh my gosh, 2 desserts, right? You can see the line breaks on here.
Now, just out of curiosity, here it's all flush. So if you were writing, should it?
Yeah, you would have the indents. This is just a feature of chat and Zoom.
Okay, I was just curious about that.
1/2-inch indents for every new paragraph, whenever they happen. Dialogue, not dialogue, unless it's a pull quote, and then we can talk. Pull quotes don't happen in dialogue. Okay, are you ready to write? Okay, on your marks, get set, write. You have about a minute left. Okay, your time is up. We're about to hit a really barky period here, so I'm going to mute for now. Okay, it's looking like you all are pretty ready. The barking has subsided for now. So, who would like to go first this time? Kay is shaking her head.
I never mind, but I don't need to.
Well, I can, I'm not really happy with it, but you know, I
That's
just,
okay.
6 minutes. Okay, so here we go. I'll try to speak louder here. So how do I tell you, like, this is in quotes, because it starts out with a quote. So like,
Just use your voice to
okay.
project that you're in dialogue.
All right. So sorry, these lock boxes are such a hassle. The realtor fumbled, punching the buttons again. No worries. I'm just excited to see the place. Jill finally stepped over the threshold and met the sun shining through high windows. Don't you just love these high ceilings? The realtor swept her hand high. Jill hated for her first words to be a complaint, but it had to be said. I can tell they've just painted. Love that smell. But why this squeamish yellow? Oh, that's easily remedied. A nice new coat of paint won't cost much. Gently running her hand over the wall, Jill thought, won't cost much for you, you mean? And then I didn't finish it. I was trying to open the window to hear the birds, but didn't get that far.
That was a great start. What do you all think?
It wasn't hard to tell that who was talking and when.
Right.
So that's good. I was gonna say that it probably should be something that we can tell, even though you're reading and not being able to see the quotes. So awesome.
Yes, sir. It's really easy to tell who is talking. Oh, I turned evil. And Joan, did you have something you wanted to add or?
I thought that it was really good because one of the things that caught my attention was the high ceilings, which I live in the South, and in New Orleans, a lot of the architecture has high ceilings because it was designed that way before air conditioning to take the heat away. And even with air conditioning, it does help. And so I thought that was an important detail. And also the issue of the paint, the color of the paint. And I think, the internal dialogue that she had about the cost of the paint, how expensive was it going to be to, like the realtor felt like, oh, that's not a big deal. But then to her, it's like, oh, that's going to be pretty expensive to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. And your whole scene became more rich because instead of saying, Jill said, you gave us details that told us about this moment and exactly what Joan said. She's got anxiety about, like, this is the place. She loves the light. We know that she thinks she's found the one, and already she's anticipating a big expense that's going to go along with it. And that matters to her. And we got all that in, say 5 lines of dialogue tops. And so look at the work that action did for you. And it's particularly important that the actual words of dialogue don't do work. I mean, they can do work, but what I mean is that, the realtor might say something like, this house has gone down a lot in cost. And so that if you have to do extra work, you should be able to make it up of the difference in the sale or whatever. Like a lot information dumps, especially people like to have characters announce information about themselves. Like, but I'm an MIT graduate with a startup company, and instead your actions or thoughts can help bring that stuff forth without it having to be people giving information dumps and dialogue. So I thought it worked great.
Okay.
Good.
A fun exercise.
Who's next?
I'll go.
Okay.
Sitting in a backed chair in the front of the group, Scott folded his legs. So Cassie, who are you and what do you want most in this life? His voice startled Cassie. She pulled the hospital bed table close to her chest as she leaned forward in her chair. I work in finance. I'm a student. I love animals. Scott unlocked his fingers and laid his hands on the metal arms of his chair. I didn't ask what you do. I asked who you are. Raising her eyebrow, I don't know what you mean. Who are you? Describe the part of you that is unchangeable, untarnished, innately valuable. For 20 years, those questions swirled around in Cassie's mind. Scott's voice cut through all the bullshit in her head, made her feel safe. As Cassie hit play on SoundCloud to hear Scott's most recent podcast recording, the air left her lungs when she heard his voice. The one she relied on to settle her torment sounded airy, soft, almost unrecognizable. Me too.
Oh, okay. So thoughts from Kay and Joan?
Well, you did everything that, she had talked about, that in the sense of don't use he said, she said. You used ways that I knew who was speaking because you said, well, one of them raised their eyebrows and said, whatever. And I absolutely could follow the whole conversation. I could see them sitting in the room. I could see her pulling the tray close to her.
I almost said tightly against her chest, and I was like,
yeah, no tightly. None of those adverbs. But I just think it was, I could see the scene and I could hear it and I could see the two people conversing. So it was very clear.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think he asked kind of a existential question there about who, like who was she? And she was kind of going into the direction of what she did. And I think that for many people that there's this kind of identity crises, or, like where what they do defines who they are. And I think that it was a good question, that he asked. And I think she's still kind of struggling with understanding the question, or what would be an appropriate answer, because I don't know if she really knows who she is.
For sure she didn't at that time, right?
Right.
So great observation, Joan. Don't we love it when we're reading something and a great question like Scott's question happens, and as a reader you pause and go, do I know innately who I am? Do I know what's the non-negotiable parts of me that make me who I am? I don't know that I do. And so I love when writing brings wisdom into it like that, where as a reader you're asked to ask the same thing, and we're feeling a lot of empathy. I think I felt it for Cassie, because she's being asked this question sort of out of the starting block. And that's a lot to ask of somebody when it sounds like Scott and Cassie have just met and he's just inhabiting a role now in her life in that way. But then the big punch in the gut, something that would almost make this, if it didn't have such a long-term feel that it's going to go in part of a novel, it would almost make it function as a flash, is that punch in the gut at the end where you jump 20 years and she's been listening to his podcast all those years, and this time he doesn't sound like he's well. And that just ripped my guts wide open, because we had that scene and we can see where his directness was something we learned from the 20-year jump that she's still listening to the podcast that worked so well on Cassie. But we don't know it until you jump the 20 years. And then you land us with this awful piece of information, which you created a ton of emotional investment in very few words. And I suspect it had to do with setting aside boring dialogue tags and making the work happen in between them, with the action beats, with the sensory moments, with the thoughts. It was really effective. And I'm a little choked up about Scott, which I realize is silly because I just met him in this moment, and I'm worried for him. I'm worried for Cassie because he means so much in her life still. So, wow, good one. So 2 great examples so far, right, of how effective it is to do something other than he said, she said, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Joan, did you come up with something you want to read?
Sure.
Okay, great.
All right, I'll go.
Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, Jules saw his great-great-grandfather, Jean-Paul. He was wondering about this new world that he was in, so he walked over to Jean-Paul. Hey, Gramps, can you tell me a little bit about this place? Where are we? We're in heaven. That's cool. I sure hope that we get to eat some good food like gumbo. Sonny boy, there is wonderful food like gumbo. The difference is that it tastes like gumbo and looks like gumbo, but the substance of it exists without having to hunt or fish. It just is. That is good to know, because that is my favorite food, and I've always hoped that heaven would have my choice foods. Let's go get some gumbo then, Grandpa. And one thing I wanted to note, since I'm, I guess, focused from a Louisiana perspective, is I misspelled go. So in this context is Geaux, which is a way that we spell go, like for go Saints or go Tigers.
Yeah.
It's not correct in French or in English,
Right.
but everybody in Louisiana knows what it means.
Yeah, would that be sort of Creole? Like,
No, that is just something that I think we made up.
so English 550 will teach you what to name that, because it's a legitimate word at this point in the lexicon in Louisiana, because I know it, and I'm in Washington State.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is it called?
Well, I would have to think that through. I haven't taught that class in about 4 years.
Oh, okay.
I can't think of the exact word. It's like, because I don't think we studied, but I know the book that you use in there would have it in there. What do you do when you take the sound of an English word and you spell it with a French seeming spelling? I don't know what that is, but we're finding out.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I know it's not French. I know it's not correct French, because I started taking some French, and it's not correct French, but it's the standard form for Louisiana.
Yeah.
Go Tigers.
I mean, I'm trying to think of what it would be. Wouldn't it be Vont Tigers in French? Because it'd be the we go, right? Let's go. Let's go Tigers.
Yeah. And I'm still
Alonzi. It'd
getting
be
French.
Alonzi, actually.
Yeah.
Not Vont. It's Alonzi Tigers, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
We.
Okay, sorry. Kay and Sarah, thoughts on the dialogue? Could you tell who was speaking?
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Gramps and the other person. Yeah.
Joel, I think.
It's, what was his
Joel.
name?
Joel.
Joel. So I think that was, yeah, I mean, I definitely was following it. I want to know where this gumbo is, you know. So, you know, I think it was a really easy interaction in a lot of ways to follow, and, you know, using the what did you call it? The action tags,
Pigeons.
beats and things like that. So anyway,
Okay. Maybe. I
Wait,
kind of
I couldn't hear you.
Nothing.
That's it.
I was trying to come
Sarah
up
Go ahead.
with
said that go could maybe be pigeon, and I think she might be right. Pidgeon.
Gin.
GIN.
G-I?
I think it's GIN.
Pigeon is-
Piggin.
that is
Oh,
pigeon.
embarrassing. Spell it my way and find out what you get. No, seriously, because I want to know where I got it from. Maybe I have my pigeon of pigeon. Sorry.
You should-
Gins.
Pidgeon. Am I picking it up from the bird pigeon and putting it
I
on the
think
word
so.
pigeon? Oh, how embarrassing.
Well, maybe that's a pigeon.
Changes it to pigeon.
Yeah, okay. I'm so sorry, Joan. Yeah, I do think that is actually pigeon, but it's a weird pigeon because it's French spelling, English pronunciation, which is a little different than true pigeon.
Yeah,
Which-
pigeon here in Hawaiian is it's a very different dialect, and it's
Yeah.
a combination of some Hawaiian words and English words. That's what they
Yeah.
call pigeon.
Yeah, it'd be like almost a whole sentence where you would have
Yeah.
half Hawaiian words, half English words type thing.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Yeah. All to say with your dialogue, okay, so one thought I had was you wouldn't even have to have Joel have those first couple actions. You could have begun with him speaking to Gramps. That would have actually been a clear moment, especially if we were coming out of the code mixing. I like that. Especially if you were coming out of the doorway scene into the scene, we wouldn't have to walk him over there. You could go straight into it. And then one thing that I really hung up on mentally was, is he really in heaven? Because I thought you mentioned that he might walk back through the door. So maybe he has seen the light but goes back into his body. And what I wanted to get at was, could this be his construction of a heaven in his mind? Because there's no sensory details at all during the part where he's talking to Gramps. And heaven is exactly what he wants it to be. It's his favorite food, right? and maybe that is what heaven is. And literally an author could be making that point, that we design our own heaven. And heaven for Joel is endless gumbo that hurts no animals, right? But those things stood out as a reader for me to pay attention to, that the lack of sensory detail, which absolutely could be a choice for all the reasons I just said. And this sense that Joel got to have exactly what he wanted. And I mistrusted that because I like gumbo, but my heaven isn't going to be full of gumbo, right? It'll be full of horses and horse milk probably.
And I think then, it could be developed further because there's always this, I guess, question mark in Louisiana about what the perfect gumbo is, because there's gumbo and there's many different ways to fix it.
Sure.
And so, we could possibly flesh out into that, like, what is this perfect heavenly gumbo? Is it going to be seafood? Is it going to be okra? Does it have tomatoes in it? Which, there's a whole argument in Louisiana about, do tomatoes go into gumbo or not? I'm of the persuasion that they don't go in gumbo.
And suddenly gumbo is a metaphor for heaven, right? Whose heaven is what? The way that gumbo is made. How would my heaven be made? How would your heaven be made? Yeah, I love that. It's a great idea. So I'm hoping that today, with what we worked on today, you got a sense of, oh my God, just stop wiggling.
Wait, code mixing, what's that? I'm
The
sorry, I was
go,
reading the
your
Code-
GEAUX go could be code mixing as well.
what is code mixing? Maybe I'm
It's
It's-
a term, it's a linguistic term. And Sarah will pull up the definition because I can see her doing it now.
okay, cool. And I'm
Um,
sorry about that. I was just reading that. I'm like, what
yeah,
is
yeah.
that? Okay.
There's code swapping, code mixing. I think it probably means the same thing. So English 550 is a whole lot of fun, actually. It shows you how flexible the English language
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah. And it might fit in there. Again, this specific example, it's not studied in this exact form in 550, but I like the idea that code mixing or code swapping could be what's happening there.
It's interesting. I wanted to say that in my classic text, the character is alone for without any other human contact for the majority of the book. And I just think this is really interesting how, and the way the author fixed that is obviously she's thinking a lot and her thoughts without him saying, I'll have to look through the book again and see if he says she thought. I think that he doesn't really say those words, but also he created the character of the dog for her to talk to. And so just the way,
Remind me of your classic text.
it's Island of the Blue Dolphins.
Oh, right.
So she's on
Right.
this island and she has nobody to talk to.
That's why the dog is there.
He, I think the author
Castaway.
dog. And
Yeah,
so
you have to have your character in juxtaposition. That's why in Castaway, Wilson
yes,
shows up, right? You can't have
Yes.
Tom Hanks by himself the whole time.
I
Even
thought
though
that was
he's,
so clever.
yeah, and he's painfully by himself. I mean, more than a typical movie would have
Yeah.
somebody by himself. And so same with Island of the Blue Dolphins. When I say that your character needs to be in juxtaposition, I guess I need to be careful to say it doesn't have to be another human, you know?
Right. Could be a volleyball.
Sure. And some of the best young adult books that I loved as a kid, the character was most in juxtaposition with a horse, right? I mean, that's what happens when in Black Beauty, when the boy is stranded on the island,
Right,
he gets the horse,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So all to say that dialogue can do so much for you to bring your characteristics of your character alive. And also what we learned about moving the dialogue without using dialogue tags, that same technique of giving action beats, of having them be able to sort of go places or do things or notice things, you can use those without dialogue too. It's just to note that sometimes when you spend too long inside somebody's head, or if you just spend too long without saying what's happening outside of them, your reader can be untethered from the experience and taken out of the location because they're too much inside your character's head. And dialogue with another person, and especially those sensory details and the things that make your character come more alive, but also keep us in scene with them, those are all really important. An author that you can watch do this pretty reliably. So some of the circles that I move in are pretty, literary, erudite people. I have great connections with people from, say, Massachusetts, which believes itself to be the heart of the literary US, right? And they are frustrated or think it's unsubtle to watch authors be reliable. But I love to read authors who bring in predictable ways that I'm studying with all of you to see how to do fiction well. So I don't think that all of us have to be Hanya Yanagihara writing A Little Life and ripping us to shreds over like 800 pages of a heartbreaking book, right? I also think there's a ton of value in Diana Gabaldon's The Outlander series, right? It's so much fun. We care about what happens to the main characters in it. she's a very reliable author. You can watch her step back and put us back in scene or characterize somebody. So she's somebody to look at when you want to see dialogue being done in these ways. Another person who is darn reliable, whatever the problems or not problems, depending on your viewpoint of her politics and her gender beliefs, is J.K. Rowling. And she writes under the pen name Robert Galbraith for the Cormoran Strike detective series. And that, I think she's 5 or 6 books into it now. And those books, I mean, they are just a classic study. And when does she spend a little bit too long in dialogue? Boom, you'll see an action beat. When does she not quite have enough detail in her scene? Boom, there'll be a list of things on somebody's desk. I mean, she, right when you say this is, I'm missing something, she'll throw it in there for you. So those are 2 places when you're reading like a writer, if you enjoy either of those types of books, that you can see an author very reliably doing the kind of work we talk about this class, our classes.
I have a
2
question.
easy
For you.
examples. Yes.
I have a question. So let's just say it was something like a courtroom scene, and it's not really your traditional dialogue because it's more of an interrogatory. Then how would that be treated the same way, perhaps, or?
Yeah, and what you can do is the kind of interrogatory that would happen in a courtroom, you keep it alive and interesting by details from the courtroom, by physical manifestations of characters in that courtroom. Maybe the judge is looking disinterested. Maybe, the things that whoever your narrator, whatever they can observe, maybe the room has dust motes coming through light through a high window, whatever. The things that keep us grounded in the courtroom, remind us where we are. Your narrator can kind of comment, especially if you're doing the memoir, you as a person can comment on, if somebody says that never happened, your narrator can say, and that was the first lie that was told in the courtroom, right? And so there's ways that you can interpose between literal transcript from a courtroom scene and how to make it come alive for all of us. And say your character wasn't even in that courtroom, but is using those documents. You could have so much fun with this in nonfiction, because you can say, I wasn't there, but I imagine at this point the judge rolled her eyes, or although I couldn't witness it, I imagine a slight quaver in my father's voice when he answered, or whatever. Of course, I take that back. Your father would never quaver based on what I've read. But, then you could say, I know that my father's voice was steady because this is who he was, right? So what's super fun about places that you haven't been, but you have the content for, you get to do all this imaginative stuff in the background that actually brings forth the message of your memoir. So you get to interpret the scene even if you weren't there, which is way more fun than the stuff that you witnessed.
I have a question on that then. When you say like, I imagine such and such, does that get you around point of view intrusions?
Yeah, you had a tiny point of view intrusion happening with Scott, I think, in that what you read. I think we were briefly in Scott's point of view, weren't we? Because we had his sensory detail. Or was it just an observably hard chair? Is that
It would be someone could see that he was in a chair, that he folded his legs.
okay, gotcha. So yeah, imagining as a nonfiction writer gives you so much room. The only requirement really is for, as you're narrating, to acknowledge that you didn't have the experience, but you're giving a version of what you think it was like. So if you wanted to take on the point of view, like say that chapter you wrote where Cassie was taken out of Darcy's house. What's her name, Darcy? Say in that chapter you wanted to inhabit Darcy's point of view. Even as fiction writers, this is a great technique, particularly if you are writing from one point of view, which is often a great thing to do, though in fiction and larger fiction, you can switch point of views between chapters, or in a short story, you could have a really clear break. But like in English 529, they actually require you to stick to one point of view. That one point of view can do some imagining, and suddenly everything breaks open. We get to have the other point of view, as an author, you get to make all those choices. I mean, that's the words I imagine, or I wondered if it was like, or oh man, that things come alive when we do that kind of work in our writing.
Okay.
Other questions? I'm honestly super excited about the way your writing went today. I felt that practicing putting in something other than dialogue tags worked out really well. And I actually hope people will watch this video, because if they can witness how well it worked for you, then maybe the dialogue assignments will go better than I'm hoping. Dialogue is one of the hardest things we work on always as writers. And when we get it right, it's obvious. And when we don't, it's obvious. Well, if you don't have any more questions, I thought this was.
I just wanted to say one other thing, and that when you first started talking about how dialogue in a story is different than how we normally talk. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and I just, scrolled down to how they transcribed it, and reading just the transcribing of the podcast. And, there's so much, and it's like really boring
Yes.
to listen to it, because it's just people kind of stumbling over their words, repeating themselves, so forth. And I just thought this is really helpful to kind of think about it so differently, about how do we write it in a way that captures people's attention. So it's very helpful.
Absolutely. And so you will almost never find a hi, how are you? Fine, how are you? In writing, unless it serves a purpose, right? And you might get a how are you, but the hi isn't going to be there, or, and actually that's something that, as Robert Galbraith, J.K. Rowling does, that's a little annoying. She does have some highs in there that, like her character Robin will say, hi. And listening to the narrator offer that, I say, was that necessary? And I think that's what's most fun about both of those examples I gave you, as people you can see reliably doing stuff, is I will, as an editor, say, I don't know for sure you needed that one. So I love that they are not perfect at it, because it lets me pass judgment. I mean,
Yeah.
I haven't written best-selling series, so who am I to pass judgment? But I do, because it's a place that I feel comfortable wondering if they could tighten it up, because I think people that write long series also maybe don't get to spend quite as much time in the editing process as people who are publishing like 1 or 2 books over a lifetime, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that nobody's work is ever going to be completely perfect.
No, mine for sure. I'm the first one lining up. If this book ever gets published, you all are welcome to write me and say, wow, that dialogue could have been better. And I'll say, you're right.
Yeah. Keeps you humble.
Boy, I think you have to be humble to be a writer. I really do, because stuff gets out there in the world, and then you realize something you've done, and there it is. You can't take it back at this point. But that's why you get good editors too. At least stand by the version that got out there.
One thing I wanted to say on that, relative to like when I was studying history, is I saw in a book that the individual had the information, but he had it kind of swapped, like the number of people for this versus the number of people for that. And because it's supposed to be objective and peer reviewed, then I've seen that repeated in other places. And it's probably was a typo, but the typo then becomes like this objective peer reviewed something.
Yeah.
That's almost written in stone.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's really hard to correct. If it shows up in an early version that's been getting repeated, it's nearly impossible to take that out as a fact anymore. I mean, there has to be a pretty big splash on it. And if it's not that, in other people's minds, that important of a statistic, they won't even try that hard.
Right.
Yeah.
I figured that out the hard way with some of the history stuff I was working on.
Yeah. Sorry. Embrace the words I imagine. That's what's so
Exactly.
great about creative writing. You get a chance to really tell the story as I said last time with Tim O'Brien's story, truth versus happening truth, this is your chance to tell your story. Well, I thought it was a great session. I hope that you learned some things that were helpful to you. And that
Yes,
we
thank
will
you.
be, I'm planning to meet again in 2 weeks. I don't know the date. If this is the first, it must be the 15th. So the morning of October 15th, if you're interested in coming.
Okay.
Great. Well, I hope you all have a great
Thank you.
weekend.
Have fun.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thanks.
Happy birthday.
Thanks. Bye.
All right, bye.